Well, you all thought that last panel was great. This next one's going to be even bigger and better. How do I know that? Well, let's see. How do I know that? Because it's going to include immigration and workforce and housing all smooshed into one panel. That's pretty big. That's complicated. And we're going to see how it works out. We've had rehearsal conversations over the phone and the like, and we'll see how it works, but it's part of a grand experiment. We think these things are all tied together, and the discussion at the end may prove that true. But let's get going here. So our first speaker comes all the way from Washington, D.C., Audrey Singer, who I should mention used to be a student of mine. Not at USC, and not at the University of Wisconsin, but all the way back to the University of Texas at Austin. And she was really a very brave person who came over to my class in urban planning when she was a sociology student, and anybody who does that is a very brave person. It shows you how she's always been looking more broadly at her fields of study. Audrey also was a member of the National Academy of Science panel that was the sister panel to the one I was on, the one headed by Mary Waters, and what was the panel called? It was the Integration and Assimilation panel, which also produced a book a full year ahead of my panel. So they had excellent talent there. Audrey can speak about quite broadly about everything. She's a senior fellow at the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute. Formerly, she was with the Brookings Institution for a decade or more, and you may have known her work from there. So she's an expert in U.S. immigration policy, the geography of immigrant settlement. So looked at a lot of occupations and occupational growth of immigrants and native-born. She's just got a broad base of expertise, and we're really fortunate to have her on our panel today because she can respond to questions more broadly than practically anybody. So Audrey, would you want to come up here and offer your presentation, and then I'll introduce the other speakers in turn?
Hi, everybody. Got a height differential here. So what Dowell didn't mention is I think I was in his very first class he ever taught. And now I'm catching up to him little by little. So, and I think I have more gray hair than him, too. So I wanted to just say how nice it is to be out of Washington for a few days, think about other things, think about California, and I really enjoyed trying to put something together for this group that I hope contributes to a bigger discussion. Because I'm going to talk mostly about immigrants and the native-born in the labor force. I'm going to compare California to the rest of the United States in total. And I really thank Louise and Ethan and Dowell for setting up a lot of the demography, which I think will come into play in your minds as we go through the rest of the day, and it's definitely going to help. It helped me think about what I want to talk about. So California is often viewed as ahead of the curve in terms of economic, social, cultural, political issues. It's also, in some ways, ahead of the curve demographically, as we've seen. So if we look ahead at the aging of the United States and the shrinking labor supply because of retirement of the baby boomers coming through, changing racial composition, we can anticipate in some ways how California moves through that and what that means for other places around the country. I want to show a very specific piece of these trends and look ahead. The questions I raise are relevant not only for California, but also because of the policy moment that we're having right now around immigration. So I'll start with a really basic set of numbers, and that is the number of foreign-born persons in the United States in 2000 and in 2015. And I'm using the term foreign-born and immigrant interchangeably, so anybody born outside of the United States with any kind of background, including any kind of legal status background. So you can see on the left in 2000, there were 31 million immigrants living in the United States, and California's share of those immigrants was 28%. By 2015, there were 43 million immigrants in the United States, and California's share was lower at 25%. So there are a lot of sources of population change that we've already discussed in terms of birth rates, internal migration, and also international migration. In particular, Mexican immigration is down, and net immigration has slowed. In terms of foreign-born growth, these numbers come from Public Policy Institute of California. The growth in the 90s of the foreign-born population in the state was 37%, in the 2000s 15%, and in the first 5 years of this decade, it's down to 11% growth. The source countries have also shifted recently, and we've already touched on that. In the last 5 years or so, about 53% of all immigrants came from Asia, which is a very wide geographic area, and only about 22% from Latin America. But I want to focus today on workers, and in particular, workers who are of prime working ages, 25 to 64. And I am going to show you a bunch of slides, and don't be scared when you see that you won't be able to see the numbers way back there. But I'll talk you through them, and hopefully we can make sense of them together. So in the United States, about 19% of workers in the prime working ages are foreign-born. In California, that's 37%, so more than 1 in 3. And I want to talk about skill levels, and the way I've defined them here is low-skilled workers are those without a high school diploma. Middle-skilled people are those with at least a high school diploma, but they may also have some other training, certification, or some college. And high-skilled are those with at least a bachelor's degree, but they also include people with graduate degrees as well. And this is a graph that shows on the left, the first two sets of bars are the native-born population, and on the right, the foreign-born population. And you see it's like national California on the left, national California on the right. So California's native-born workers are slightly higher skilled than all U.S. workers, and California's foreign-born workers are slightly lower skilled than all U.S. workers. So that's just sort of the setup for where we're going to go in the next couple of slides. In terms of the foreign-born population, specifically, California has even shares of low and high-skilled workers, about 30%. The distribution for the native-born is quite different. Only 5% of California and the total U.S. population do not have high school diplomas. So there's a lot of different things going on in this country in terms of sources of labor supply and demand for different workers and different skill levels. I want to talk about what the growth of the labor force might look like under I'm not going to show you various conditions of immigration, but have that in your mind. As we've just seen, immigration has been slowing overall. But what I've decided to look at is occupations, and occupations that I have two sets of slides, and I'm going to show you both of them. The first shows the list of occupations expected to have the most job growth between 2014 and 2024 in California, and the second will show those occupations that have the fastest job growth. So the first set of slides are talking about large numbers of jobs, and the second set of slides talk about the growth rate of those, or it's ranked by those that are fastest growing, but they're generally much smaller numbers of jobs that are expected to be available. And so I've looked at these occupations, and you'll see in the next set of slides that I've segmented the occupations into the 3 skill categories: low, middle, and high. And then I've ranked those occupations that are either the ones that will grow the most or the ones that are the fastest growing by the share of workers in those occupations that are currently foreign born. So people who are working in those occupations now who are immigrants. And so that's what I want you to keep in mind if we're looking to the future and we're looking at retirements and we're looking at slower immigration, what that might mean for California's labor force. And it's the state as a whole. And I just turned off the whole machine. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm going to break this down. This is just to give you the general pattern, and you can see at the top. And remember, the length of the bar is the share of the population that's foreign born. But if you can see, now I can't see, but the yellow, those in yellow are low skilled. So those are the occupations that that people who don't have a high school diploma, that's the requirements for those jobs. And green is the middle skilled, and blue is high skilled. So this, just an overview, shows the 20 occupations projected to have the most job growth, again in that period 2014 to 2024, ranked by the current share of workers who are foreign born. And I also, and maybe this is overkill, put 2 bars for each occupation. The top one is California, the bottom one is the US total, so you can have a reference point. But in general, and there's only one occupation that I found in the top 20 of each of those sets of occupations that I talked about where the US has a greater share of immigrant workers than California has. So I'm just going to take you to the next set of slides, which goes through these occupations at the skill level, each skill level. So these are the low-skilled workers, and 12 of the occupations with the most job growth among the top 20 are considered low-skilled. They require less than a high school diploma. That doesn't mean everybody that's working in these has only a high school diploma, but that's sort of what BLS tells us those jobs require. And I should mention, these data come mostly from the ACS, the American Community Survey. We've got farm workers at the top. 85% of California's workers are foreign born. Restaurant cooks, janitors, cleaners, construction laborers, food prep, personal care aides, all occupations with half foreign born. And as we go down the list, those numbers get smaller, but still about a third of all of these low-skilled occupations are filled with immigrant workers. In the middle skilled, we see that office workers, customer service and supervisors of administrative support, and food prep are in the top 20. And these 4 middle skilled jobs have relatively high shares of immigrants working in those occupations right now. And the 3 of them are office jobs, and 1 is food prep supervisors. In terms of high skilled, there's also 4 occupations. There's a mix of industries, and in California, the top one here shows that 59% of software developers of applications are immigrant workers, 39% of accountants, 38% of registered nurses, and about a quarter of general and operations managers. So finally, I'm going to show, so just to remind you, those occupations at the top of the list are projected to have hundreds of thousands of jobs in terms of job growth in that period. And these are the fastest rate of growth. And the numbers are much smaller in terms of total number of jobs expected in each of these industries. And again, here's the overview of the fastest job growth. And about half of the occupations with the fastest job growth in California are in the construction industry. And let me take you through low, medium, and high, and then I'll conclude. So in terms of low-skilled occupations, 2 out of every 3 cooks, insulation workers, brick masons helpers, electricians helpers, and roofers are foreign-born in California. And for most of these fast-growing occupations, much smaller shares of current workers are foreign-born in the total U.S. labor force as a whole as compared with California. There, it's more about 1 out of every 4. In terms of the middle-skilled jobs, more than half, there's 8 occupations on the list of the fastest growing. More than half of all mechanical insulation, cement, iron and rebar workers, brick and stone masons are immigrants in California. And again, these are workers who fit in that middle range, high school diploma plus. Almost all of these occupations on this list are related to the construction industry. Very high shares in a couple of these occupations are foreign-born. For example, 71% of insulation workers and half of all of the cement masons and rebar workers are foreign-born. Yeah, on this list at the very bottom, you'll see there, if you can see these skinny little lines, there's the one occupation on both of these lists that has a smaller share of immigrant workers in California than in the United States, and they're elevator installers and repairers. And then in terms of high-skilled, this shows the six of the fastest growing occupations are in the high-skilled category, and more than half of all applications developers and statisticians are foreign-born. More than a third of cartographers and biomedical engineers are foreign-born. So we've got a lot of our colleagues who are in this group of high-skilled, fast-growing occupations. So this leaves us with a lot of questions about California. Looking ahead at the labor force and sources of growth, as we see the boomer generation retiring, as we see birth rates slipping, what does that mean for the state's economy as a whole and its role in the United States and in the global economy? Looking at the state as a whole also ignores regions, and we know that there are regional trends and realities out there. There's a lot of talk about immigrant competition for jobs, kind of out in the air, maybe less so in California or in some places in California, because this has been an established trend for so long. But I think I'll end with that question that Dowell raised, which is, how do we make sure that the next generation is well prepared to enter the labor force, especially when we look ahead at what maybe the projected labor force looks like? And so the children of immigrants are certainly going to play a big role in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Next speaker is going to be Megan Kirkaby, who's a policy research specialist in the California Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD as we call it. She's also been actively responsible really for the draft statewide housing assessment, which is nearing its completion status, I guess. It's been going on for about a year now. Trying to figure out, well, how many housing units do we really need and who's going to live in them? And are they going to be affordable? So if you have any questions about affordable housing, you can talk to Megan later at lunchtime and give her your complaints. And she has a Master of Public Policy degree from the other university across town, the Luskin School of Public Affairs. But we won't hold that against her because she's doing great things for the state of California. So Megan, why don't you come up here, and your presentation, I think, is loaded.
Thanks so much, everybody. As Dal said, I'm Megan Kirkaby from HCD, the California Department of Housing and Community Development. And also, as a 33-year-old married woman with no children, I'm pretty convinced that my parents have bribed the conference organizers to have so much discussion on fertility today. But I'm going to talk a little bit about housing, which for most of us who've worked in housing feel like a lot of these conversations end up revolving and coming back to housing and housing affordability. As Dal said, we've been working on the draft statewide housing assessment for about a year now. So what is a draft statewide housing assessment? This is a statutorily required document that we put out that's an overview of housing and housing-related needs and challenges with a 10-year forward-looking horizon. Our goal is to offer options to address those challenges, including specifically the needs of lower-income households and vulnerable populations. What we want this to end up being is a guide and a reference tool for all of you, housing practitioners, policymakers, affordable housing advocates, academics, and others. And we're very proud because this is the first time that we've put out a draft since the year 2000 when we released our Raising the Roof statewide housing assessment. We are coming to quickly the release of our final draft. So you'll get to see a little bit of updated numbers today and hopefully a new final draft sometime this summer. So California continues to grow, but one of our major findings in the assessment is that production is not keeping pace with our projected housing need. We work with Department of Finance and a team of academics on determining what the forward-looking housing need is based on population projections and household formation rates and other factors. And we're looking at 180,000 units needed annually between now and 2025. But we can see that that is far below what we're currently producing. But when we look back to where we have permit data going back to 1955, we can see that this has not always been the case. For the last 10 years, we've been averaging less than 80,000 new homes annually. But from 1955 to 1989, we were averaging more than 200,000 new homes annually in California, with a much greater percentage of multifamily homes. This isn't just a one region issue. This shows the fourth cycle, our fourth housing element cycle from 2003 to 2014, the regional housing need compared to what was actually permitted. This overlaps greatly with the Great Recession, and so these are even more below average production. But you can see that there's not one region of the state that's producing near what its housing need is. And overall, it got to about 47%. But a lot of that was focused on the higher income side of the spectrum, not the multifamily and lower income. The green, which I'm sure is really hard to see here, but we have the thermometer up top, is how many tax credit, low-income housing tax credit units were built. So that's how much deed-restricted affordable housing we got in that last housing element cycle period. So we try in the assessment to also take a look at why is this happening. Well, California's residential planning and development process starts out with that need number. That we start out with that big need number for each region. And as we go through every step towards the actual development and putting units on the ground, we have constraints that cause us to lose units along the way, whether that's lack of implementation or lack of resources, community pushback, uncertainty, and high costs associated with permitting and development fees, and then market shifts that can make a project that started out looking like it was going to pencil no longer be able to make it, especially if it encounters the need to lower density as a response to community resistance or add parking. Those cost changes can push a development out of the realm of possibility. When we also look at that cycle of and compare on the left what you have is job availability in terms of jobs per capita by county. And then on the right, you have forced cycle production. So from that same time period I was talking about, what is the housing unit change for each of those counties? And so we are not getting, I will say this enough, I say this again, but we are not getting enough housing anywhere. There's no region where we're getting enough, but where we are getting housing is not as close to job centers and transportation as it could be. And we start to see some consequences. Nearly a third of California renters are paying more than half of their income toward rent. And this is affecting our lowest income households disproportionately. Rent burden is when you're paying more than 30% of your income towards your rent. Severe rent burden is when you're paying more than half of your income towards your rent or your housing costs. 80% of our extremely low income households are severely rent burdened. Oh, sorry. This was the last graph one that I was talking about, but I forgot to show. So when we look at the actual housing stock, we can see a part of how that happens. We have renter households in greatest need, the very low and the extremely low income households, more than double the number of rental homes that are available at prices that those households could afford. And by afford, I mean paying no more than 30% of their income toward rent. So lack of housing has effects far beyond just can people pay their rent or not. It affects our economy. Both the University of California at Berkeley as well as McKinsey have done studies on the impact to California's economy, and looks like upwards of $200 billion lost annually as a result of not having sufficient housing capacity. When housing is factored in, California's poverty rate is the highest in the nation. Housing supply is also affecting our economic mobility. A lot of families have to make choices about where they live, and many of you may know Raj Chetty's work showing that children growing up exposed to poverty have a greater chance of lower economic mobility later in life. So we also need to be working on what we can do to increase community development and economic development in our existing areas that are experiencing disparity, as well as increasing the supply of housing in areas of opportunity that have often been exclusionary to housing. There are also effects on environment and transportation. As households are moving further from jobs, there are longer commutes that are putting strain on those households, but also higher transportation costs and higher pollution. Housing instability is negatively impacting mental and physical health. And there are a burgeoning field of studies around the idea that providing housing can actually reduce health services costs along the way. And in terms of education, children, especially children experiencing homelessness, experience reduced academic outcomes. So that's all sad stuff that I just talked about. It's very hard, the housing crisis in California. But we do have some hope. What we lay out in the statewide housing assessment are potential options to address California's housing challenges. We place those into three broad categories: reforming land use policies, addressing housing and access needs for vulnerable populations, including seniors, persons experiencing homelessness, persons with disabilities, farm workers, and other groups, and investing in affordable homes and community development. We know that we need to impact our land use policies, but also that that may not get to that very low and extremely low income households with just market changes. So we were pretty thrilled to see a lot of the work that we put into the statewide housing assessment has influenced the governor's principles in the January budget this year. I included those up there. But streamlining housing construction, lowering per unit costs, production incentives, so rewarding cities that are doing the right thing to try and make it easier to build housing, accountability enforcement, as well as ongoing housing funding, acknowledging that there are going to be households that are not going to be met by those market solutions. So we're now in an exciting time. We're right at the close of the first, most of the bills in the legislature have moved from their first house to their second, but there are ideas swirling around in each of these categories. And so we're hoping to release our final statewide housing assessment later in summer, focusing even more specifically on what are some of the actions that can be done right away, as well as for that next 10-year long period to address California's housing challenges. So this is just a closing slide, but as Dal mentioned, we've been at this a long time. We started a public outreach campaign last January when we released the draft. We did 60 days of public comment, as well as 6 public workshops, a statewide webinar, 30 other events throughout the state to try and get the word out about the statewide housing assessment. And we have been able to incorporate the many written comments we received, as well as what we were able to catalog from all of those stakeholder sessions into an updated version to get out to all of you by the end of this summer. But in the meantime, if you visit hcd.ca.gov, you'll be able to see this draft statewide housing assessment. And you can always sign up to receive the latest version as soon as it's released. So thank you.
And thank you, Megan, for all that you do. It's a very difficult job, we know. People live in houses, workers live in houses, but nobody wants to have houses be built next door. To try to tie this together, we are going to invite Michael Bracken to speak. He's going to provide more of the business perspective. He's the managing partner and chief economist for Development Management Group, and it's a firm that specializes in services related to economic and fiscal impact analyses. And from my conversations with him, I found that he has a pretty broad view on how the pieces fit together, and that maybe he has the magic answer, or at least he has a piece of the answer, because it's a complicated story that we're trying to work our way through to a happy ending. So Michael, come on up.
Well, good morning. Oh, come on, we can do better than that. Good morning. Good morning. There we go. You know, I was thinking the last time I was on this campus was in 1989 when I ran in a collegiate track meet. I was a collegiate athlete out at Cromwell Field, and I was young, skinnier, and had significantly more hair. So I do want to thank SCAG and USC for having me come out and speak to you. A couple things I want to disclose. One is I think every private economist should disclose what their political affiliation is. I think it's important so you understand our perspective. I'm a decline to state. I typically am a very, what I would consider to be a very pragmatic economist, typically have equal disdain for both sides of partisan politics. But that said, I'm a little bit like Estelle Getty for those of you who are a little bit older and remember her from Golden Girls, so you will, the filter is usually missing in terms of what is on my mind relative to information I think you need to have. I do want to thank Audrey and Megan because what they did is provide you with a lot of statistical information and background that you need to have to begin to understand the gravity of the situation that's facing California and the United States. And I want to take that and maybe make this into a little bit more of a pragmatic view in terms of how we go forward. Make sure I've got the right slides up, so give me half. Okay, there we go. So I want to provide you just a couple statistics about what I see And then I'm going to give you basics of what I call Municipal Finance 101, which is important to this discussion, especially when we talk about RENA numbers and why there is or is not housing growth. And then I want to provoke some thought about the housing shortages and the labor shortages that we're facing, along with some ideas for solutions. This next slide is kind of interesting, and it is meant to be provocative here. This gentleman here, his name is Myron Howell, and he actually is the drummer for Jake Owen, who's a country artist, and many of you may know him. Met him a couple years ago, and I knew someday I was going to use this picture for something. Because it doesn't say, to me anyway, what it says on that shirt. It says something, I guess, parallel, and that is, if you do work, you should eat. If you do work, you should have a place to live. And I think those are important values as we look at our nation and look at our state and look at our communities. And it was an amazing shirt. He wore it in front of 75,000 people. I'm very fortunate that AEG Golden Voice is one of my clients, so I get all access passes. And so I grabbed him and said, I got to get this picture, and I knew I was going to use it someday, so here it is. So as we go on, let's look at a couple statistics that I think will go to this premise. One is construction of housing in California is not keeping up with demand. We know that. Housing affordability continues to decline. And we are becoming a state, the have and the have-nots. And every statistic that we have about income shows us that. California does rely, and we know this from what was presented by Megan and Audrey. California relies on immigrant labor. California relies on lower skilled labor, some of which is also immigrant labor, and in fact, in many cases, we find that it is. And the fastest growing professions in California are those that are lower skilled. And this is going to be extremely problematic for us as we go forward. You can all tell, by the way, I just got new glasses, so I'm learning how to go back and forth with them. I probably should have brought my other prescription. But along these lines, we've got some other things that we're going to talk about. I'm going to show you what's happened to the labor force and labor force participation, which is something that certainly is beginning to affect California and our ability to propel our economy. But let's go through a couple statistics here as well. One is 20% of adults 25 and over, 20%, 1 in 5, lack a high school education or GED. And those are the folks that are in those lower skilled professions. By the way, the same folks that are in a major housing crisis. At the same time, 15%, often the same folks, are living in poverty. 15% of Californians, 1 in 6 people in California are living in poverty. There are regions in California where that number is actually more like 30%, and that should be scary. In fact, there's two regions in California where one third of the students in our school system are living in poverty. 1/3, 1 out of 3. Since 2010, we've had one home built for every 5.5 occupants, where historically we've built one home for every 2.5 occupants. That tells you the gravity of the housing crisis. So unless we're all going to go back and relive our fraternity days in college and live 17 people to a house, we need to build more houses. But there are some roadblocks to that we want to go over. And I want to bring this point home about housing affordability. And I want to use LA County for an example. In LA County, the median income is $56,000. And that affords about a $235,000 home. That's what it'll do. So how many of you live in a community where you can buy a home for $235,000? There's about 3 of you. Cheryl, you came here from El Centro today. Absolutely. By the way, you cannot buy a new home in El Centro for $235,000. A new home is about $100,000 more than that. In fact, in LA County, there's only one community where the median home price is at the $235,000 level. And that's a little community called Little Rock along the 138 on the Pear Blossom Highway in North Los Angeles County. I would consider it a wide suburb about 30 minutes east of Palmdale. That tells you the gravity of the situation. But many of us in this room are economists, so let's do Econ 101, right? It's just a supply and demand deal. When you have lower supply and you have higher demand, prices are going to go up. End of story. This chart probably says everything you need as a background for some solid conversation about what's going on in California and nationally, and that's relative to labor force participation. That top line there, that gold line, is the labor force participation rates among seniors. It's going up. So, in fact, how many of you in the room are over the age of 55 and you're still doing this? Yeah, for a lot of reasons. One, I like to make money, but two, you want to be engaged. And as we now know that 60 is the new 50 or 50 is the new 40, I'm still a lot slower than I was when I raced on Cromwell track. I'm not totally sure what happened. But the other part of this is you got to see down at the bottom, that lower line of that light blue, that's the labor force participation rate of those in their 20s. That's declining, and that's a significant problem. The result of this is not tough to predict, and that's workers are going to leave California, and they're already leaving. They're going to Phoenix, they're going to Las Vegas, they're going to Oklahoma City, they're going to Texas. They're going where they can afford. Because if you're a lower skilled worker and you can only make in an economy $10, $12, $15 an hour, you're going to go where you can afford to live. Because that same $10, $12, $15 an hour of wage here is probably the same wage as it is in Oklahoma City. But there you can afford to buy a house, which means we're going to have more and more labor shortages, especially in food prep and a lot of our tourist industries. The only industries that are going to be left in California are those that can't leave. Because any industry that can leave, any company that can leave will, because they can take advantage of housing availability for their workforce and really what we would consider a more stabilized workforce for them. I'm going to go quickly into Municipal Finance 101 because this is going to drill down on this. And many of you here are with cities, and so you understand how this works. Cities are funded by and large by sales tax and transient occupancy tax, also known as hotel taxes. Property tax, which most people think cities get rich of, cities on average get about 10% on the dollar. So the real world example, a $500,000 home, that city's getting $500 a year in property tax. That's it. Well, where the rubber meets the road is this. It costs between $650 and $1,000 a year per person in a community to provide basic services. 2/3 of that money is going to public safety. The result between municipal finance and of what those costs are and what that person brings in local government funding, for every home they add, every home, the average city sitting in this room loses between $1,500 and $2,000 a year. So explain to me what their incentive is to welcome new homes when they're struggling with budgets and trying to figure out, geez, we're going to lose money on every one. I mean, there are lots of companies out there that follow that premise, and sooner or later they're in bankruptcy, as there are a number of cities in California that are in bankruptcy. Now, Megan, I promise you should not take this personally, but let's talk about why. Prop 13. So many of us in this room are old enough to remember and know what Prop 13 is. ERAF 1 and ERAF 2 that raided more city money away and took that money and diverted it back into schools, and the loss of redevelopment. So I'll pose this question. $7 billion a year was shifted when redevelopment was disposed of from cities and counties to the state of California. 20% of that, $1.4 billion a year, was dedicated to low-mod housing. Low-mod, that was the 20% set aside. There's been nothing done to replace that. And that certainly is a problem. In fact, and you read it here, that $1.4 billion is enough to build 10,000 new homes for low-mod families a year. So I wish Jerry were standing here, because I would look him right in the eye and say it. Thank you. 10,000 families a year cannot afford housing, partly because you destroyed city and county's local budgets. Well, what are the ideas for solutions? Let's go into that. This is my last slide so that we can move forward with the conversation. The first thing is this. Why don't we recognize that every job in California matters? And it matters equally. Whether it's the gentleman that served our breakfast today, how about the lady or gentleman that are out there harvesting lettuce in 122-degree heat, which is what it was yesterday in Imperial County, 122. They're just as important to our economy as those that are coding software. So why is that? Well, how many of you plan on eating a disc for lunch today? No? Hopefully they're going to put some salads on the table here in another half hour or so. That's pretty important. We need to reconstruct our tax structure. We need to reconstruct it in such a way that it rewards cities to build houses. In fact, how about this? Why don't we say to communities that build low-mod, because that's where the biggest issue is right now, cities that build low-mod housing, so for coveted low-mod housing, you'll get a greater share of property tax to help you pay for police and fire. Because among other things, the assessed valuation of that home is going to be lower than what your average home is. We need to recreate redevelopment and a tax increment tool in order to produce infrastructure and low-mod housing. We also need to reinvent our guest worker programs. You go back to the 50s, 40s and 50s, we had the Bracero program. The guest worker program did work in California and can work again. In fact, it worked nationwide. We need to do that, especially to propel those lower skilled positions. And finally, we must reward work with pay. I'm going to go back to Myron and what he said. If you don't work, you don't eat. But if you do work, you should eat, you should have a place to live. Thank you. Megan and Audrey, do you want to join me down on the chairs here for a little Q&A with Dal? All right, are we okay now? There we go. What states are seeing the largest growth in foreign-born?
Sure. Well, the trends have shifted to the southeast and somewhat still in the southwest in certain areas. But overall, and I've been looking at this since 2000, we've seen a shift in the geography of settlement with the New South kind of pulling in immigrants in rates that we haven't seen before.
So Megan, here's one for you. I was actually talking earlier with the folks from the census too, and it seems like visually that we're seeing a huge rise in homeless and what I'll call suburban homeless encampments, not just the urban in the downtown, kind of what we'd see in the, what we see in downtown LA, but we're seeing these in more suburban areas along riverbeds in Orange County, for example, the Great Trail. What is HCD's role in addressing this relative to your work?
I mean, that is a good point. We have the largest homeless population of any state in the nation. I believe we're at 22 or 23% of the nation's homeless population is here in California, while we have only 12% of the nation's population. There have been two big wins for trying to address homelessness in the past few years. The first one was the Veterans Housing and Homelessness Prevention Program, which we're about to be in our third cycle of, which approved by voters, moved some underused home buying loan programs funding that we had available to be available for rental housing for homeless vets and their families, as well as supportive services. And so that program has at least another 3 years going to address that, as well as HCD, approved by the legislature last year, is working on a program called No Place Like Home, which will be $2 billion in bond funding specifically to address homeless populations that are also experiencing mental illness. But overall, it comes back to everything we talked about, that supply might not help solve homelessness, but the greatest cause of homelessness is housing costs. And so if we can start to address housing costs, we can also start to address our homeless population.
Again, I want to stay with you. I'm going to ask each of you one more question as we wrap this up, but I want to stay with you on this. And that is, what does HCD propose in terms of CEQA reforms to help propel housing growth? Let me go a step further. You talked about regulatory reform a little bit in there, and you also talked about meeting market conditions and how market conditions change throughout that process. The cities in here will tell you that the process for which to approve housing, whether it's master plans, tract maps per se, is reliant upon the CEQA process because that's state law. And oftentimes it takes between 1 and 2 years for a housing developer, for a master plan community, or for any, not anything but an infill to make it through that. Talk to us about what HCD is potentially going to be able to put before the governor relative to CEQA reforms, or if maybe that's not even on the radar screen.
Well, what's recognized in the statewide housing assessment is that there is environmental review at the planning level, but often we're ending up with the need to do environmental review at the project-specific level. And if we could focus more on planning level environmental review that would allow projects to tier off of that, that would be beneficial. That's one of the things that's recognized, as well as last year a streamlining proposal was put forward that for projects that met certain criteria, they would be able to do streamlining. I think that is very much still in the statewide housing assessment.
So like an environmental integrated general plan?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I got one last question then for Audrey, and that is, and this we'll probably close this thing in a very glim way, but what happens to an economy like California or nationally if the borders are, and I say in quotes, closed?
Well, the border is only one place that people come in to this country. So right now, I think a lot of people are aware of the fact that there is net zero migration from Mexico the past couple of years. That means people are still coming in, but as many people who are coming in are leaving. But there are a lot of sources of
and I apologize. When I say closed, I'm also mean
all
the
borders.
H-1 visa. Yeah, I mean the entire, what we'll call the border is, to those of us who have businesses in Imperial County, Cheryl's sitting there, I would suggest that we agree. The border is nothing more than a nuisance. Immigration is a hot topic in Washington, D.C. It is not in El Centro, California, because folks tend to, we just know that that's a nuisance for us. So, no, I'm not talking about the physical border, but the visa program.
California has always led the way on immigration issues, for better or for worse. And so a lot of people are looking to California, not just the governor, but mayors and other elected officials around the state, and also around the country, because what has happened is as Congress has been, let's just say, ineffective in terms of changing policy on immigration or defending certain policies on immigration, states and cities and counties and in communities all across the country have taken matters in their own hands. And I think that will be a continuing trend. We already see it. But if enough things happen, I just saw, I shouldn't have been looking at my phone, but I did see that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the executive order that is called the Muslim ban in the fall, but in the meantime are letting it go through in a limited fashion. Not sure what that means. But all I'm saying is there may be enough pressure, if people keep pressure on for the things that they're interested in, and this can go in many different directions, obviously, for Congress to actually take matters up and move legislation forward on all of these issues. I mean, I don't think we can expect a grand plan at this point, but I do think where the pain points are, we may see more action. I mean, I can't predict that, but at least people might be motivated to start talking about it in a way that could move things forward.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Megan, and thank you to the audience. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah.